I would love to be that person that Steve just described. If you saw behind the scenes, you would know that some of those things that Steve has seen were me at my finer moments, maybe, but I've had many that are not so fine, and I'm really humbled by that. Kelly, thank you. Kelly and I met last year at a conference, and then when I, agreed to come here, and I looked at the schedule for tonight, and I realized Kelly was going to be on this stage presenting tonight, but I had no idea what I was in store for. Thank you for the way you have grieved and lived and thanked, and the way you have modeled that for us so beautifully tonight. Thanks. Fred, where are you?
I'm not here.
Oh, you're not? Okay. I heard you don't usually show up. No, actually, no. I didn't say that. No. I've heard about this place for so long. I've heard about this wonderful event, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced here this week with you. It's really been extraordinary. You are an amazing group of people, and there's a lovely spirit in this place, and it's been wonderful to be here. Andrew said, I think, on the first night, where are you?
I'm not here.
You're not, nobody's here. It's a good thing I showed up tonight. But no, I think on the first night, you sang a line that said, we were meant to be right here all along. And it really feels true to me tonight. I think you also used a line that says, not all who wander are lost. Did you sing that? Yes. So the first time I saw that was on a Harley Davidson poster. And so I thought it was a motorcycle thing, but now I realize it was Tolkien, right? He came up with that. Strider said that, not all who wander are lost. So it's been a great week to be here with all of you, and I've gained so much, and I'm honored to be here tonight. In just a few weeks, Bill and I will be celebrating our 40th anniversary at Willow Creek. Our first service was on October 10, 1975. And sometimes that seems like it was just so long ago, and sometimes it seems like it was just yesterday. Bill and I were 23 when we started Willow. We had very little wisdom, but great passion and a couple of pretty good ideas. We both believed that the age-old message of the gospel ought to captivate the minds and hearts of our peers. Unfortunately, most of our friends didn't want to have anything to do with that message or with the church. But Bill had the heart of an evangelist, and he believed that the church had a critical role to play in reaching people far from God, and so that was his goal. I had the heart and the education of a social worker, and I had a very holistic view of the gospel, and I believed that the church should be a refuge for the marginalized. Well, I love the combined vision that Bill and I had for the church. I love seeing men and women who had been far from God find a safe place where they could begin to ask questions and gain understanding and become true disciples of Jesus. And I love seeing people who had fallen on hard times financially find help through our food pantry or our financial counseling ministry. And I love seeing single moms receive cars from our cars ministry so that they could go to work and they could take their kids to the doctor. I love seeing families with children with special needs, with Down syndrome or autism or learning challenges. I love seeing these families receive help and support from a community of people who really understood and loved their kids. I love seeing immigrants in our church learning English as a second language. I love so many of the ministries of our church, and I have been an active volunteer since the very beginning. But in the early 90s, a fairly inconvenient thing happened. The pastor's wife lost her faith. And yes, I do mean me, and I do mean I lost it. I entered a very dark night of the soul, as many adults do when they realize that the faith and the Christianity or the God of their childhood is inadequate or maybe even toxic for their adult life. and they have to begin a very painful deconstruction of what they thought was their faith. For me, this crisis was prompted by a combination of utter exhaustion physically and by a deep and ever-deepening depression that I had been battling for many years. I finally went to a counselor and said, I am so miserable, I want to die. But I have a husband I love, I have 2 kids I adore, and a church full of people who I don't want to hurt. But I need help. Well, the more we talked, the more I realized that I had a lot of healing to do, physically, emotionally, relationally, maritally, but especially spiritually. You see, since I was 7 years old, I had been trying to please a God who was a harsh, demanding tyrant, for whom I had to be very good and work very hard and follow all the rules. Well, I was a very nice, serious little Christian girl, so I did that with great earnestness. And as a pastor's wife, I did that with great earnestness. But I discovered that you can only strive for God's love for so long, and eventually you just don't have the energy anymore. And that's what happened to me. And so I knew that in order to find a healthy, more sustainably, and maybe even a more joyful way to life, I had to get off the many treadmills of being perfect and being productive and keeping God and keeping everybody else happy all the time. I knew I needed to get off all those treadmills and rest. But there was a problem. The unrelenting God of my childhood would not let me do that, would not let me rest. So not out of rebellion, but out of desperation, I turned my back on that much too burdensome God and on Christianity as I had known it. I was 40 years old, married to a fairly public pastor, and I'd lost my faith. I felt like a confused, broken, and terrified heretic. My journey back to a Christianity that I could believe in was long and meandering. And it led me often through the writings of poets and mystics. Poets and mystics, because they use the language of mystery, and they live with a sense of mystery. And although I didn't realize it at the time, and I didn't know why I kept being led to the poets and mystics, but I learned that I needed to reclaim the God of mystery. I grew up in a Christianity that had everything sorted out and everything made sense and God made sense, and yet he never really did to me. You know, the other night, Kay Warren talked about how her journey through the crucible of great pain led her to a place of renewed hope, but also to a renewed realization that there was much about God and about her life with God that she had to put in a big box called mystery. And I think that becomes true for many of us as we get older and as we experience more of life. And one of the things that I had to accept about myself during that era was that when it comes to God, I am a serious doubter and questioner and struggler. So I had, and I continue to have, a big box filled with mystery. The poets and the mystics also pointed me to the words of the ancient desert fathers and the mothers, as well as more contemporary contemplative writers, many from a Catholic tradition that were very new to me. And they all pointed me in a single direction, into silence and stillness and listening. And that began a profound healing in me. I began to sense, as I sat in silence, that it was okay to just sit, okay to just be silent. I was not breaking some big moral law of the universe by getting off from all those various treadmills and resting. It was okay. As I continued that practice of silence, I felt my soul coming to life. I wasn't ready to be a Christian again. It wasn't that simple. But eventually, the healing work of silence awakened in me an authentic desire to look again at the words and the ways of Jesus. So for months, actually for years, I only read the Gospels. I will confess that. I only read the Gospels. But as I immersed myself in Jesus, I found two things that I didn't even know I was looking for. First, I found the lover of my soul. I found a living presence who says, if you're weary, come to me and I'll give you rest. If you're empty, come to me and I'll fill you. If you're lonely, come to me and I'll be with you. And I realized that those words were offered not just to weary Middle Eastern men and women in the first century, but to me, an empty, weary, depressed, and confused American woman in the 20th century. In Jesus, I found a resting place. I found a great heart of love beating for me. I found the reality of an unconditional love that was and is just waiting to embrace me and heal me again every day. And that changed everything for me. My fundamental reality shifted from being not able to measure up to a tyrant God to being able to sit daily in the presence of the lover of my soul. And that became a foundation that I could build a life on. But that's not all I found in Jesus. The second thing I found in Jesus was a radical call to compassionate action in the world. He said, care for the sick, the poor, the naked, the hungry, the imprisoned, and it's like you're doing it to me. He said, pay back evil with good. Love your neighbor and even your enemy. He said crazy upside-down things and created a crazy upside-down community known for the way it loved. And he calls us to join that today. If I could sum up everything that I just said, I'd say this. I'd say that Jesus entered the depths of my brokenness, and he offered me unconditional love and healing. And then he called me to follow him into the depths of the brokenness of the world, to follow him there. And I think that most of you here probably can relate to that. Maybe you wouldn't use the same words I used. You wouldn't say mystics and poets and deconstructing your childhood faith. Maybe you've never called Jesus the lover of your soul. But I bet that most of you have had some kind of deeply transformational and healing experience with Jesus that now beckons you out into the world, that beckons you to care for the things in this world that are broken and marred and ugly and destroyed. And that's why you're here. I really believe that's why you're here, bringing the fullness of who you have become in Christ and placing yourself before God and saying, here I am. What is mine to do? And that's a wonderful place to be. And I commend you all for being here and for placing yourselves before God as you have. But to get back to my story, right in the midst of my rather chaotic journey into and through my own brokenness, I came face to face with one of the harshest realities of the world that we live in. It was the early 90s. There was a war taking place in Eastern Europe as the former Yugoslavia crumbled. And it was a brutal war, complete with mass rapes and mass murders and mass graves, and horrific crimes against humanity. Soldiers would come into a village and rape all the women and take all the men and the boys over 13, and most of them never returned home again. Well, twice during that war, I was invited by a humanitarian organization to travel to Bosnia and to Croatia, once actually with Steve. But that was the ground zero of that war at that time. And although I felt too confused and broken to have anything to offer to anybody at that time, especially to people who were suffering, I decided to go. And as that turned out, I think that my internal brokenness at that time opened me in a profound way to the brokenness around me. It was the first time I'd seen war up close, and I was stunned and devastated by what human beings can do to one another. I met widows who had lost everything: their husbands, their homes, their livelihood, their friends, their hope. I met children who were so traumatized by seeing their parents die when shells landed right inside their houses that these little kids just sat in school all day and chewed their fingernails and just stared into space. It was the only little bit of control that they had. And I walked through an entire city park that had been turned into a cemetery filled completely with the war dead. Every The date of death on every gravestone was between the years of 94 and 96. The day before I left to come home from that trip, I just went off by myself and climbed to the top of a hill that overlooked the countryside of Bosnia. And I sat there for hours and wept and prayed for the women and the children that I'd seen, for the widows and the orphans and the traumatized and the displaced, for so many suffering people. And while I prayed, an unbidden question started echoing in my mind. Am I my sister's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? And the reverberating answer was yes. Yes, yes, you are your sister's keeper. And so I asked, well, then who is my sister? God, who is my sister? And I so clearly sense God say this. They are all your sisters. They're Croatian Catholics, the Serbian Orthodox, the Bosnian Muslims. They and every other woman you will ever meet are all your sisters. And every man you will ever meet is your brother. Because whether they know it or not, they are all part of the human family that I have created, and I love them. I learned that when you open your mind and your heart to God and to the world, you end up with a huge family. And you realize that every single member of the family is as important to God as you are, or as your kids are, or as your grandchildren are. And you can't possibly meet the need of every family member, but you can never dismiss their needs thoughtlessly, because they're family. And that realization has ambushed me over and over again. I'll be standing on a street corner somewhere, surrounded by strange music and a strange language, and by clothes and culture and religion very different from mine. And I think, oh yeah, these are my people. This is my family. And I can't begin to explain how that realization has changed the way I listen to the news, the way I pray, the way I spend my money, the way I travel, where I travel. Distance doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. Religion doesn't matter. If there's trouble in the world, it's touching my family. Well, since that first trip to Bosnia 22 years ago, I've ended up in other war zones. That was never my plan, but sometimes we don't know how and where God is going to guide us. But I've been in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the deadliest war since World War II is still going on today, and where it is frequently and horrifically waged in women's bodies, as brutal rape is used as a weapon of this war. Rebels say it's cheaper to rape a woman than to waste a bullet. And if you rape enough women, you can destroy the soul of an entire village. I've also spent much time in the Holy Land, where politicians continue to bicker and incite hostilities rather than lead toward a peace that could free both Jews and Arabs from their prisons of fear and hatred and violence. And I've seen what most people never get to see on the news, that there are men and women of peace, both Israelis and Palestinians, who show up every day working for reconciliation and healing. Some of my favorite peacemakers in the Holy Land are men and women, mostly Muslims and Jews, who have lost children to the violence of the conflict. But day after day, they stand together in schools and churches and synagogues and mosques and say there is a better way than this violence, a better way than revenge. Let's end this now. Let's talk. And we don't hear about these people on the news, but they're there, and they're heroes. And I have loved taking many American faith leaders to the Holy Land to meet with people like that, with Israelis and Palestinians who say, if you're coming here to take sides, don't come. We don't need more friends like you. But if you're coming here to be truly pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian and pro-peace, then come and join us and help us walk together toward peace. And I am so grateful that I get to know people like those. But as I've spent time in the Holy Land, I couldn't help but notice and become aware of what's been happening in Syria for almost 5 years. And you've heard the statistics, recently especially. Since the spring of 2011, over 200,000 Syrians have died, have been killed. Over 4 million Syrians have been forced to flee Syria as refugees, and over 60% of those are young people and children. Another 12 million Syrians are still inside Syria, but they're destitute, needing food and water and medicine, aid that very seldom manages to get to them. And 7 million of those people have actually had to flee from their homes because their homes have been destroyed or they're too dangerous, and so they are literally on the run for their lives in an active war zone, day after day. Well, I won't even begin to try to explain this war. Suffice it to say that there's a government regime willing to kill its own people and to destroy its own schools and hospitals and turn its own neighborhoods into rubble. And there are untold rebel groups fighting for who knows whom, each more vicious than the last. And then there are the Syrian people, men, women, and children suffering as they always suffer in war. I got directly involved with the Syrian refugee crisis 3 years ago when a young pastor that I met via Twitter emailed me and said, I just saw the horrible news about Syrian refugees, and winter's coming and they don't have shoes and it's cold, and I want to do something, but I don't know anybody over there. I don't know what to do, but I know you travel to the Middle East a lot, so let's team up. I'll raise some money, and you find some trustworthy organizations that we can give it to. So we did that. And it was actually a very modest sum of money that my young friend raised. But in the process of investigating and vetting organizations on the ground, local Jordanian and Lebanese NGOs and churches, I was personally gripped not only by the pain and the suffering of people, but by the amazing ministries that these people were doing and the way they were serving these people, these refugees. And so about 18 months ago, in May of 2014, I spent a week in Jordan visiting with Syrian refugees. And we often hear about the huge refugee camps that are established by the UN, and I did visit a massive refugee camp like that in Jordan. It's called Zatari Camp, and between 85,000 and 100,000 Syrians are living in that camp now, and many of them have been there for 4 years. They're living in tents in the desert, and they don't have any clue what the future holds for them. But in some ways, they are the lucky ones, because the majority of the refugees in the Middle East, in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey and Iraq, are not in those camps. They're just living in abandoned buildings or unfinished construction or in tin shacks or in whatever they can find. And they can't legally work, and they don't know where the next meal is coming from. Many of them were highly educated, hardworking professionals in Syria, and yet now they are in a foreign land, totally destitute. Well, one afternoon in Jordan, I sat on a concrete floor in a dilapidated apartment in a city in Jordan with Syrian women, refugee women, and some of their kids. And their empty eyes told the silent story of their losses and their grief. In Syria, as I said, they'd been middle-class women just living their lives. And then suddenly, they were on the run for their lives. They'd seen people die, and they saw their communities exploding, so they grabbed their kids and crossed country borders in the middle of the night in search for some kind of future, some kind of hope. Leaving Syria with nothing but the clothes on their backs, they made their way to some abandoned buildings, but they had nothing. Some of them got food vouchers from the UN, but those only lasted for a little while, and then they had no way to get food. They had no access to medical care or schools for their children. And unable to forget the horrors of the violence that they left behind in Syria, many of the mothers refused to let their children out of their sights, so they couldn't go outside. So their whole world was just this little ramshackle room with a whole family living in it. But in that community where those refugees found space, there is a church and a pastor and his wife who believe that God has put their church in that very community in order to serve these refugees. So volunteers from the church visit the families and say, "What do you need? Tell us." And then they provide as best they can according to each family's need. Food and hygiene packets, diapers and milk for babies, mattresses, children's clothing, medicine, of course, food. It's not a big church, but they're now caring for 600 Syrian refugee families, and just another 250 Iraqi families have come into that community, and so they're trying to help them. Now, this church has no slick marketing team. They have no fundraising campaigns. They serve on a wing and a prayer, trusting month by month that God will provide what they need for these people. Now, every Saturday, about 200 of the women, the refugee women, come to the church to get food packets and other supplies, and then they spend a couple of hours at the church because they know that at least there, their kids can play in safety. And these women are all devout Muslims. They're covered except for their faces. But each Saturday, they have a meeting inside the church to learn about grief, or how to help their traumatized kids, or about how to adjust to a new culture, whatever would be helpful to them in that situation. And on the last day that I was in Jordan, it happened to be a Saturday, and the pastor asked if I would speak to these women. He said to me, "I think they'd really like to have you speak, but you need to understand something. We are committed to respecting, to loving, and serving these women. That's what we believe God has called us to do, to love them, to respect them, and to serve them." Now, they believe in the God of Abraham, and they have deep respect for Jesus, so you can talk about Jesus, but do it in a way that's respectful to them. And these women have suffered so much, so please offer them a loving presence. And remember to use words that will serve them and lift them up and encourage them. And so, with the help of a Palestinian pastor's wife, a friend of mine who went along to translate, these are the words that I said to those women that day. "I wish I didn't have to stand up here in front of you. I would rather sit beside you on a cushion on the floor and have a cup of tea with you. I would like to snuggle your baby in my arms. I would like to hear your story. I know you have a sad story, and if I heard it, I would weep, as I have with some of you this week. I know you are good and loving women, and I'm sorry you have lost so much. I'm sorry you had to come to a country and a city and a house that is not yours. I can imagine you in your own country, strong women serving others. I can imagine you making beautiful food and sharing it with your family and friends. I can imagine you caring for your mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, sisters and brothers and friends, just the way I do, because that's what women do. We are compassionate. We give, we serve, we protect. We work hard to make the world better for the people that we love. And wherever I go in the world, I discover that we women are all very much alike. We may have different clothes, different hair, different language, different culture. Maybe our skin is a different color. Maybe our religion is different. But in our hearts, we are the same. That's why we can look into each other's eyes and feel connected. And we can talk without using words. We can smile and we can hug and we can laugh. And sometimes we can feel each other's pain. I have prayed that God would help me feel your pain. I wish I could remove your pain. I wish I could help you carry it. Last night, while I prayed for you, I remembered a story about Jesus, the Christ. In this story, there is a woman who had been suffering for many years, and she came to Jesus. She was sick and ashamed, and nobody had been able to help her. Nobody could heal her body or comfort her mind. People had given up on her. They were ignoring her. But she believed the Christ could heal her if she could just touch his robe. So she pushed her way silently through the crowd that followed Jesus. She was afraid he would turn her away if he saw her, so she stayed in the shadows. And finally, she touched his robe. Immediately, he stopped. "Who has touched me?" he asked. "Power has flowed out of me, and I want to know who touched me." She was afraid, certain he was angry and would punish her, but she felt compelled to answer. "It was me," she whispered. "I'm the one who touched you." The crowd hushed, anxious to see what this great man would do. Jesus simply looked into her eyes, straight into her eyes, and said, "Daughter, your faith is great. Your faith has healed you. Go in peace." When I first read that story, I wondered why Jesus stopped, why he forced that frightened woman to speak up. And so I prayed to God to help me understand that. And this is why I think Jesus stopped. I believe he wanted her to know that he saw her. She wasn't just an anonymous person in a huge crowd. She was an individual woman, and he saw her. And he knew she was suffering, and that broke his heart. He called her daughter so she would understand how much he loved her. He said she had great faith in God, and he honored her for that. And then he healed the wounds of her body and her soul. As a Christian, I said to these women, I believe that Jesus shows us what God is like. He shows us that God sees each of us as individuals, and he calls us daughters because he loves us, and he honors our faith because he knows it can make us strong, and he cares when we suffer, and he wants to bring healing and comfort and peace into our lives. Some verses in Scripture even tell us that Jesus weeps, which means that God weeps too. He weeps for all of his suffering daughters. I wish I could end the war ravaging your country. I wish I could gather all the money in the world to help make your lives easier. I wish I could bring back all that you have lost. I can't do any of that, but I can do this. I can go home and tell what I've seen, how you are suffering, and how amazing Jordanians are walking lovingly with you. Both you and your Jordanian friends need the prayers and the support of American Christians, and I will tell my friends that. I will also tell my friends how beautiful and strong and loving you are. I will tell them that you are women of deep faith in God, women who adore your children as I adore mine, women who sacrifice willingly for those you love. I will tell them that when I look into your eyes, I see that we are sisters. I will not forget you. I will pray for you. I will tell your stories. I will weep when I hear anew of your suffering, and I will rejoice over any goodness that comes your way. Truly, I will not forget you. God has placed you in my heart. And they remain in my heart. And now, unfortunately, they have been joined by their Iraqi sisters, those who have been fleeing ISIS, Christians, Muslims, men, women, and children whose dreams have turned to a steady stream of nightmares. In March, I was in Iraq with the Preemptive Love Coalition, a wonderful ministry that cares for the displaced people in Iraq, and those people who have fled ISIS. And I just want to tell you one brief story from that trip. You may have heard of the Yazidi people. That was a religious and ethnic minority in the northern part of Iraq that has been particularly targeted by ISIS because of their particular religious beliefs. ISIS believes that the Yazidis are the epitome of infidels, so they have targeted them. And a year ago, ISIS laid siege to many thousands of Yazidis in the Sinjar Mountains, and many of the Yazidis were killed, and thousands of women and girls were also kidnapped to be used as sex slaves, and they are still held. But in March, I met with some of the Yazidi survivors who were dramatically rescued from the Sinjar Mountains about a year ago, but not before they had watched their spouses and children die from dehydration and starvation, or from bullets in their backs as they ran. And I want to show you just one photo from that day, from those women. And it's not a fancy photo. This is on my iPhone. This is from Instagram. But it's a photo I took of that woman that day. And sometimes a single woman kind of captures a whole story, a whole tragedy for me, and this woman does. Her name was Suzanne. She fled the horrific violence of ISIS, grieving the death of many loved ones, including her children. When she later gave birth to this baby, after she'd escaped, she chose the name Aram, which means peace after the storm. In the community of Yazidi women I met, the stories of loss and terror and violence and trauma are hard to hear. Tears are the only appropriate response. But those women are beautiful and wise and courageous women, and they fight their inner battles quietly, finding the gentle strength to go on living and loving. And there are heroes on the ground in Iraq who are embracing these women with tender, loving care and providing them with food and medicine and heaters and stoves and mattresses, meeting their daily practical needs, but also praying for the healing of their wounds and praying for peace for them after the storm. I told myself not to do a commercial for refugees. I know you have many commercials coming your way. And I know that we've been hearing a lot about refugees on the television, a lot about refugees in Europe, but I just have to tell you that long before the refugees hit Europe and hit our newspapers, there were heroes on the ground in Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq and Turkey caring for refugees. They've been the whole time there caring. And they have been doing emergency relief as all these new refugees flood across the borders. And as the refugees stay for 2, 3, 4 years, they are trying to take them onto the next level of life. They're providing schools for their kids and trauma centers where these children and women can heal. And they're starting micro-enterprise businesses for these women so they can actually get a new start in life. And you know, looking at this whole refugee crisis now, obviously it's a massive, unimaginable problem. And it's going to be a long-term situation that if any of us are willing to get involved, we're going to be involved over the long haul. But you know, Gary Haugen talked yesterday about the long and tedious work of justice. And I think he could also say the long and tedious work of healing, and the long and tedious work of rebuilding a life, the long and tedious work of just showing up to people who don't have anywhere else to turn. I want to just end with one more thought. Imagine just for a moment that you're a refugee. Imagine that you're in Syria or you're in Iraq and you're just living your life, but then suddenly all hell breaks loose and you're on the run for your life. You've lost everything, your home, your job, your dreams, your country, probably some loved ones. You've been traumatized in countless ways and you have no idea what the future will bring. And if you're a Muslim and you're a refugee in the Middle East, you're pretty sure that one thing the future won't bring is an American Christian who loves you. But I believe with my whole mind and heart that that's exactly what the future must bring to all those who are suffering in the Middle East, whether they're Christians or Muslims or Yazidis or whoever they are. There is so much hatred and evil and suffering and brokenness all over this world, from the U.S. to the farthest reaches of the globe. but we have the privilege of showing up in all of that brokenness with the love and the goodness and the healing in the name of Jesus. And really, isn't that the only power that truly can stand against the kind of violence and hatred and evil that is just taking over our world right now? Isn't that the only power that can stand? Michael Card, a couple of days ago, talked about biblical imagination. And if you're here, Michael, I really appreciated so many of the things that you said, and I look forward to going home and reading John and Luke and asking all those good questions that you gave us. But when you talked about biblical imagination, that reminded me of a friend of mine, John Paul Lederach, who is a peacemaker, a Mennonite, a wonderful human being who was also a professor at Notre Dame University. And he's written many things on peacemaking, but one of his books is called Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Building Peace. And he defines moral imagination as the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist. Moral imagination is the capacity to imagine something that's rooted in the challenges of the real world, this real broken world, and yet is also capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist. I think that kind of moral imagination is our calling. We're called to have the imagination to believe that if we offer to God whatever we have for the sake of this very broken world, that He can birth something new and good out of it. Maybe out of the tragedy that the world has become, we will be able to see a new and beautiful manifestation of the kingdom of God. I mean, maybe right now we are standing at the burning edge of dawn. That's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm praying for, and that's what I'm working for. And I'm really grateful for people like you who are willing to do that too. Thank you.